April 8, 1989, Guadalajara, Mexico. Federal police pin a man face down. He graduated from the same police academy as the officers cuffing him. He carried the same federal badge. For over a decade, he used that badge to do what no criminal could. He brokered a deal with Colombia's cartels, centralized every smuggling route, and embedded his organization inside the Mexican government so deep that attacking him meant arresting senators and generals. By the mid-1980s, his network moved 90% of the cocaine entering the U.S. through Mexico. He had fused the drug trade in the state into one organism. But the night they arrested him, his empire didn't collapse, it detonated. His network fractured into 4 armies: Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez, and Gulf. From those 4 came Losas, CJNG, and Beltran Leyva. Every cartel that has terrorized Mexico for 35 years traces back to one man. 400,000 dead. The government trained him, armed him, then spent decades trying to kill what he created and failed. How did one cop build every major cartel in Mexico? And why did catching him make everything worse? The badge Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo enters the Federal Judicial Police Academy in Sinaloa in the late 1960s. He is young, sharp, and by every early account, genuinely eager to serve. What greets him inside the PJF is not a law enforcement agency. It is a franchise operation running on bribes instead of budgets. Every regional commander manages his territory like a toll booth. Marijuana growers in Sinaloa pay their local chief a monthly tax. Heroin runners in Jalisco pay theirs. Gulf smugglers in Tamaulipas funnel cash to another. Cocaine, cannabis, and poppy paste glide north toward the United States while pesos flow south into the pockets of men who wear the same uniform Gallardo just buttoned for the first time. He does not stumble into corruption. Corruption is the curriculum. But where every other recruit sees a system to exploit for a monthly envelope, Gallardo identifies a structural flaw no one else articulates. Each regional boss skis his own percentage, guards his own turf, and shares nothing with his counterparts. No one coordinates shipments across state lines. No one pulls intelligence about American enforcement patterns. No one negotiates with the foreign cocaine suppliers as a unified front. The result is staggering waste, seized loads that a single phone call could have rerouted, turf feuds that burn product and attract the kind of press attention that makes politicians nervous. Duplicate bribes paid to the same officials by competing groups who never communicate. To Gallardo, this fragmentation is not a permanent feature of the landscape. It is an open invitation. Whoever stitches these isolated thieves into one pipeline controls every gram that crosses 2,000 m of border, and only a man with a federal badge, trusted by politicians above and traffickers below, has the credentials to sit at both tables without getting shot at either one. So Felix Gallardo does something no narco before him considers. He keeps the uniform. His police cruiser becomes a VIP pass through military checkpoints. His federal ID opens doors at governor's offices and clandestine error strips alike. He begins brokering introductions nobody else can arrange, connecting Sinaloan marijuana farmers with Jalisco heroin distributors. Feeding Gulf Coast smugglers classified intelligence on where enforcement patrols will thin out the following week. Criminals who once operated in regional isolation start hearing about an insider cop who can solve logistical problems no one else can touch. To them, he is a useful contact. To Gallardo, each handshake is a steel cable in a suspension bridge he is building span by span across the country. Then he arranges the meeting that transforms him from a connector into a kingpin, one that no ordinary trafficker could secure. In the late 1970s, Colombia's Medellin and Cali syndicates were sitting on mountains of refined cocaine, but facing a tightening bottleneck. The DEA and the Coast Guard were squeezing the Caribbean routes into South Florida harder every month. Gallardo travels to a remote desert ranch and lays a proposition on the table in front of Colombian representatives. Stop dealing with a dozen unreliable Mexican middlemen who lose loads and attract heat. Funnel every kilogram through one partner, his organization. He will handle every bribe, every checkpoint, every rerouted aircraft. In return, he keeps a share of the product itself, not just a flat courier fee but a percentage of the cocaine. The Colombians hesitate. Gallardo sweetens the offer with the one thing money cannot buy on the open market, a guarantee of delivery. He knows when raids will happen before the raiding officers do. He can divert a loaded Cessna mid-flight with a single radio call to a corrupt air traffic controller. Why would the Colombians trust a Mexican cop? Because no one else can promise what he promises and prove it. They shake hands. In one desert meeting, Felix Gallardo transforms from a well-connected dirty cop into the indispensable choke point for the richest cocaine pipeline on Earth. He walks out of that ranch wearing the same badge he walked in with, but carrying a new title. The the Colombians will spread across their networks the single most important drug trafficker in the Western Hemisphere. Most of his own lieutenants still do not know he runs the operation. That anonymity is by design. The fewer people who know the hub exists, the harder it is for anyone to replace him. But a choke point only works as long as nobody builds a bypass or puts a spotlight on the valve. So how does Gallardo lock out competition? And what happens when the one man he cannot bribe walks into Guadalajara with a badge of his own? The monopoly, the Colombian arrangement, rewrites the economics of the Mexican drug trade overnight. Before Gallardo, Mexican smugglers were couriers, paid a flat fee per load, disposable, interchangeable. Under his deal, the organization keeps roughly half the cocaine it transports. This is not a minor adjustment to profit margins. It is a transformation from service provider to equity partner. Mexican traffickers are no longer just moving Colombian products. They are co-owners of the supply chain with inventory to protect and revenues that multiply with every kilo that reaches American streets. That single clause turns Gallardo's network from a logistics contractor into a wholesale distributor with its own product to sell at U.S. street prices that dwarf anything the Colombians pocket at the farm gate. Pablo Escobar needs Gallardo now more than Gallardo needs Escobar, because Escobar's sailors cannot navigate the Pacific coast, cannot drive through Guadalajara, and cannot bribe the checkpoints that Gallardo has owned since his academy days. Inside Mexico, Gallardo parcels the border like a general assigning sectors before a campaign. A young when El Chapo Guzman and his partner Hector Elguero Palma received the Pacific corridor running out of Sinaloa. The Arellano Felix brothers, 7 siblings from Culiacan with a taste for violence, get Tijuana and its crossing into San Diego. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, already running heroin through the Chihuahuan desert, inherits the Huaries El Paso Bridge. Juan Garcia Abrigo holds the Gulf, funneling loads into South Texas. These are not random assignments. Gallardo chooses men he has cultivated for years. Ambitious, ruthless, capable of managing violence and logistics simultaneously. Each one understands that his territory is a privilege, not a birthright, and that Gallardo can reassign it with a single phone call. Each lieutenant controls his strip of border, collects his revenue, and manages his local bribes. But every shipment schedule, every Colombian contact number, every strategic decision routes through the hub Gallardo himself. Pull his name out and the wheel has no axle. If you're learning something from this story, tap that like button and subscribe, because the part most people never hear about is what happens next. His protection racket operates on the same architecture. This is not a trafficker slipping 100 peso notes to a municipal cop on a street corner. Gallardo embeds the cartel inside the state at every institutional level. Governors deposit cartel funds into campaign war chests. Military commanders wave convoys of loaded trucks through roadblocks on a pre-arranged schedule. Federal prosecutors shelf investigations on a single phone call. The bribes are not occasional. They are systematic, budgeted, distributed like payroll. Every official who accepts Gallardo's money becomes a stakeholder in the machine's survival, because the day the machine stops, their careers end with it. Safe houses sit on ranches guarded by active duty police officers who answer to Gallardo before they answer to their own commanding officer. Attacking the cartel now means raiding a senator's office, arresting a general's aide, subpoenaing a governor's personal bank records. Gallardo has made his organization and the Mexican government share the same circulatory system so that cutting one bleeds the other dry. By the mid-1980s, this fused machine handles an estimated 90% of the cocaine entering the United States through Mexico. American analysts know something enormous is moving products across the border, but every intelligence thread points at government officials, not street-level criminals. The operation looks less like a cartel and more like a classified government program. DEA field reports describe a shadow bureaucracy where traffickers hold government meetings. Government officials manage cartel logistics, and the line between the two has been erased so completely that wiretaps cannot distinguish which side of the conversation belongs to law enforcement and which belongs to the criminals. It appears untouchable until the DEA assigns an agent to Guadalajara who treats untouchable as a personal dare. His name is Enrique Kiki Camarena. He arrives in 1984 with a family, a stack of open case files, and a habit that terrifies Gallardo's entire protection network. He cannot be bought, not for any price. Gallardo's lieutenants have bribed judges, generals, and cabinet ministers, but they cannot bribe a man who measures success in arrests, not deposits. What exactly does Camarena discover when he starts pulling threads? And why does his investigation force Gallardo into the one decision that will crack his empire from the inside out? And when the one man who cannot be bought walks into a city where everyone has a price, what does Gallardo do when bribery stops working? the agent Enrique Camarena operates like a man who has not read the unwritten rules. In Guadalajara, DEA agents are quietly expected to file reports, attend embassy receptions, and avoid stepping on the PJF's operations. Camarena files his reports too, then acts on them. In November 1984, he feeds intelligence to a joint Mexican-American strike team that guides helicopters to El Buffalo, a marijuana plantation carved out of the Chihuahuan desert near the town of Humanius. The ranch sprawls across 1,000 irrigated hectares, fields so vast that aerial photographs show geometric crop rows stretching to the horizon. 10,000 workers tend the plants. When the rotors flatten the crop, they destroy an estimated 8 billion worth of high-grade cannabis in a single afternoon, roughly half the world's premium marijuana supply at the time. The raid embarrasses every official who knew the ranch existed and looked the other way, which is nearly all of them. Camarena has just torched the single biggest cash crop in Gallardo's portfolio and exposed the protection network guarding it all in one operation. Back in Guadalajara, Camarena keeps pulling. He maps payoff chains, which PJF commanders authorized, which shipments, which state officials signed permits for, which clandestine error strips, which military units waived, which convoys through. Every thread he tugs leads upward, past Rafael Caro Quantero's marijuana empire, past Ernesto Fona Curio's logistics wing, and straight toward Felix Gallardo. Camarena begins to grasp the true shape of the thing he is investigating. It is not a gang. It is an organism wired into the government itself. If he follows it far enough, the names that surface will include senators, generals, federal prosecutors, and possibly cabinet-level officials. For Gallardo, this is not a nuisance, it is extinction. The moment those names leak to Washington, every politician on his payroll will flip overnight to save themselves. And the protection architecture, the real product Gallardo sells, collapses within a week. Gallardo faces a binary choice, and both options carry catastrophic consequences. Let Camarena continue his investigation and the entire web of complicit officials unravels, taking Gallardo with it. Eliminate Camarena and he shatters the one unwritten rule that has kept American retaliation at arm's length for decades. You do not kill a DEA agent. That rule is enforced not by treaty but by something more reliable. The certainty that Washington will burn political capital, shut down border crossings, and squeeze the Mexican government until someone pays in handcuffs or blood. Gallardo runs the calculus. Losing his protection network is the faster death. He gives the order. February 7, 1985. Camarena walks out of the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara at 2:00 in the afternoon, heading to a lunch date with his wife. He never arrives. A cartel-funded police unit intercepts him on the street in broad daylight, uniformed officers forcing a federal agent into an unmarked vehicle while pedestrians watch. By nightfall, he is inside a safe house controlled by Rafael Caro Quantero. Over the next 30 hours, Gallardo's men interrogate and torture him systematically. They record every minute on audio cassettes, a decision born of paranoia that will later become the most damning evidence in Mexican legal history. They kill Camarena, wrap his body, and bury it in a shallow grave on a ranch outside the city. When the body surfaces weeks later, Washington's response lands like a seismic event. The DEA launches Operation Linda, the largest homicide investigation the agency has ever mounted. Agent teams flood into Mexico, demanding access to files, witnesses, crime scenes. The U.S. government orders what becomes known as Operation Camarena, a near-total shutdown of commercial traffic at major border crossings. Trucks idle for miles, legitimate businesses hemorrhage money. The message is explicit. Mexico's economy depends on American goodwill, and that goodwill is now conditional on producing the men who murdered Kiki Camarena. American diplomats deliver a blunt ultimatum to Mexico City: hand over the people responsible, or watch the economic relationship deteriorate month by month. Under that vice grip, Mexican officials who spent years cashing Gallardo's checks suddenly discover their patriotic duty. Arrests cascade. Caro Quantero is captured hiding in Costa Rica. Fanza Curio falls next. The cushion of government protection that once made Gallardo invincible becomes the thing smothering him, because every protected official now wants to offer his name as a bargaining chip to Washington. The man who once dictated orders to governors is now the asset his own allies are most desperate to trade away. But if Gallardo wired this machine so tightly around himself, what happens to the machine once he is removed? And does he really believe he can govern an empire through prison phone calls? The fracture by early 1989, Felix Gallardo was radioactive. The politicians and generals who quietly deposited cartel revenue for a decade begin shredding ledgers and rehearsing denials. Federal police commanders who executed his orders swear under oath they never heard his name. Governors who attended his private dinner parties announced anti-narcotics campaigns with press conferences and photo opportunities. None of this is justice. It is a survival theater staged to satisfy Washington before the trade sanctions bite any deeper. Every official who profited from Gallardo's network now needs him arrested more than the DEA does because his continued freedom is a living indictment of their complicity. April 8, 1989. Officers arrest Felix Gallardo at his Guadalajara home. The symmetry is bitter and precise, a man trained by the state to enforce the law. Handcuffed by the state he corrupted, sacrificed by the state to appease a foreign government. His capture is not a victory over drug trafficking. It is a hostage exchange, one kingpin for continued American cooperation. The pipeline he built remains fully operational, only its operator has changed. Washington celebrates, Mexico exhales, and the cocaine keeps flowing north as if nothing happened. Even from a cell, Gallardo believes he can hold the center. He instructs lawyers to convene his lieutenants for a summit. At a meeting reportedly held in Acapulco, he draws lines on a map of the border, formalizing the territories he once managed through personal authority alone. Tijana stays with the Arellano Felix brothers. Juarez stays with Amado Curionce. The Gulf Corridor remains under Juan Garcia Abrigo. The Pacific Sinaloa route passes to El Chapo and Elguero Palma, with Ismael Elmio Zambada rising beside them as a quiet but formidable partner. Gallardo's instruction to each lieutenant is to clean, hold your corridor, maintain discipline, avoid attracting American attention, and route all intercorridor communications through me. He envisions himself as a constitutional monarch governing through telephone calls, a spider still centered in a web that now stretches from Tijuana to the Gulf of Mexico. He is wrong in the way only architects of power can be wrong, by assuming the structure will honor its designer once the designer can no longer enforce a single consequence. Weeks pass, his phone calls go unanswered. His messages receive polite non-responses. His lieutenants discover that controlling a corridor means controlling its revenue stream, its Colombian supplier relationships, its local bribe networks, and its enforcement muscle. And none of those things require permission from an aging man in a wheelchair behind prison walls. Gallardo has not delegated authority. He has distributed sovereignty. Each lieutenant is now a head of state with his own treasury, his own army, and zero constitutional obligation to recognize an emperor who cannot leave his cell. Without a central broker to arbitrate disputes and allocate Colombian supply, the borders Gallardo drew on that Acapulco map harden into front lines overnight. The Arellano Felix brothers in Tijuana spot Chapo's Sinaloa loads transiting their territory and demand a toll, a percentage of every shipment moving through their crossing into San Diego. Chapo, who considers the Pacific route his birthright under Gallardo's partition, refuses. Bullets replace negotiations. The violence is not random, it is structural. Gallardo's system worked because he could enforce cooperation. Without enforcement, cooperation becomes optional, and optional cooperation between armed rivals never lasts. Hit squads cross corridor boundaries. Bodies appear in Tijuana alleys and Sinaloa mountain roads. In Juarez, Amado Corrio Fuentes, now nicknamed El Señor de Lost for his fleet of cocaine-laden Boeing 727s, begins expanding south into corridors he was never assigned, colliding with Gulf operators moving west. Everywhere, men who shared meals and handshakes under Gallardo's roof now share only body counts. The cooperative franchise Gallardo designed collapses into a free-for-all within months, each fragment clawing for a larger share of the pipeline its creator built. What took a decade to build fractures in less than a year, and every fracture spawns another war. He arranged chess pieces across the board with surgical care, then watched someone flip the table, but the pieces did not scatter randomly. Each one landed with its own army, its own supply chain, and its own appetite for expansion. So what grows from the wreckage, and how does one arrest in 1989 produce 400,000 dead? And if Gallardo's mistake was centralizing everything under one hand, why did decentralizing it make the violence worse? The invention every major cartel that terrorizes Mexico over the next 3 decades germinates from Gallardo's fracture. The Gulf Cartel, now commanded by Ocil Cardenas Gillen, faces a manpower problem in the late 1990s. Cardenas recruits deserters from Mexico's elite special forces. These soldiers become lost Zetas, enforcers so methodical in their violence that they redefine what a cartel is capable of. By 2010, the Zetas split from the Gulf Cartel entirely, seized territory across eastern Mexico, and introduced mass graves, car bombs, and public dismemberments as routine operational tools. A group created to protect one drug lord becomes a sovereign criminal army traceable back to Gallardo's partition. In Sinaloa, the empire El Chapo and Elmo inherit from Gallardo survives longer than any other fragment. but even blood loyalty corrodes under the pressure of billions. In 2008, the Beltran Leyva brothers accused Chapo of betraying their brother Alfredo to Mexican authorities. The split triggers an internal war that sends assassination squads into police stations and government offices. Hundreds die in a conflict between men who once sat at the same table under Gallardo's mediation. In Jalisco, the Zetas' territorial expansion provokes a reaction that births the most dangerous cartel of the 2000s. Nemesis Elno Agara Cervantes assembles local defense groups into the Cartel Jalisco Nova Jenner, armored narco-tanks, and weaponized drones. By the mid-2000s, its operations stretched into Europe, Asia, and West Africa, a global enterprise that exists only because Gallardo built the infrastructure it inherited. Since that arrest in 1989, an estimated 400,000 people have died in Mexico's drug violence. Entire cities, Culiacán, Ciudad Juárez, Riosa, Apatán have endured years where sustained gunfire replaced the sound of traffic. The Mexican military deploys tens of thousands of soldiers against organizations that exist only because one federal police officer centralized the drug trade into a single pipeline and one arrest decentralized it into chaos. Before Gallardo, Mexico's narcotics landscape was scattered and comparatively low-stakes regional marijuana growers, small heroin labs, isolated violence that rarely crossed state lines. He welded those fragments into a continental cocaine highway, and when the government removed him, it did not dismantle the highway. It shattered the only man who knew where all the valves were, and every valve burst open simultaneously. Felix Gallardo is still alive. He is nearly blind, nearly deaf, confined to a wheelchair inside a Jalisco prison. He petitioned for house arrest. The court denied him. His former lieutenants became the faces of an era. Netflix dramatized their lives. Prosecutors built careers on their extraditions. Gallardo's face appears in the footnotes if it appears at all. The architect sits forgotten while the buildings he raised dominate the skyline. He believed he was constructing a controlled system, a monopoly so deeply embedded in the state that neither side could afford to destroy it. He was half right. It was too embedded to destroy, but it was not too embedded to fracture, and every fracture produced a new war, and every new war produced fresh fractures in a chain reaction that has not stopped in over 35 years. 400,000 dead, tens of thousands missing. Entire regions governed not by elected officials, but by men with rifles who inherited corridors drawn by a police officer in a prison cell, and the reaction shows no sign of slowing. The answer circles back to that house in Guadalajara on an April night in 1989. He was never just another crooked cop. He was the only person who saw the entire board and made the first move to unify it under one hand. His badge was not a disguise, it was his competitive advantage. The Mexican government trained him, armed him, credentialed him, then watched him build the machine now devouring the state from the inside. They arrested one kingpin to solve a crisis. Instead, they released 4, then 8, then dozens, and the machine keeps running. If you want to see what happens when a federal agent uses the same institutional blind spots Gallardo exploited not to warn but to profit, watch the video on screen now. A DEA agent goes from $500,000 in debt to a Cartagena mansion, a yacht, and a $30,000 ring by exploiting a classified program that legally moves cartel cash, turning undercover ops into a money and party machine. Then his closest informant betrays him. The government seals what he told prosecutors, and almost nobody else is charged.